Alrighty, welcome to lesson number 18 of our Databases and SQL video tutorial course. This lesson is going to be about aggregate functions, which is what I was hinting at in lesson number 17 when we were talking about grouping data. So this lesson, what you're going to learn is what aggregate functions are going to be used for and should be used for. You're going to learn which aggregate functions are the most used, most popular. And obviously when you're going to use the aggregate functions is also something that's important to know and understand and learn. And we'll be looking at some examples and some syntax with respect to the aggregate functions. So first, let's start with what an aggregate function is. It sounds like an intimidating word or an intimidating phrase, if you could call it a phrase. But really, aggregate functions are derived from, they come from aggregate data or aggregated data. So really, to understand what aggregate functions are, you need to understand what aggregate data is. So let's talk about that. Aggregate data are data that's combined from several measurements. Okay, that's sort of the wiki definition for aggregate data in general. But in this case, our measurements that we're talking about are the grouped data that we have already talked about in lesson 17. So when you have any sort of grouping of data being put together into individual buckets, that's the measurement that we've made. We've taken some steps, we've massaged some data in such a way that we're putting it into buckets. Now that data is known as aggregate data. So now that we have this aggregate data, we can perform aggregate functions on the data. So an aggregate function is just a calculation that is made based on our aggregate data. Whatever that calculation is, we don't really know yet, because there's a whole bunch of different functions that you can perform, a whole bunch of different calculations that you can perform based on our aggregate data. So this really means that there's two steps going on here. That's all it is with respect to aggregate functions. Two steps. The first step is we aggregate our data, which means we group it together. And the second is we perform the calculation based on that aggregated data. Okay, whatever that calculation is. Again, we don't know. We haven't looked at it yet. We will be in just a second. But that's really all it breaks down to. That's all that happens with respect to aggregate functions. So don't be too intimidated by this idea of aggregate functions, okay, and aggregated data. It's something that I used to be intimidated by, but it's when you break it down like this, it's pretty darn simple. At least I think it is now. So let's take a look a bit further down into what these aggregate functions are all about, so you can really get a really good grasp on what it is that's going on here. So here are the popular aggregate functions. Okay, there's a handful of them that are the most popular and that you'll be using not day in and day out, but anytime that you're dealing with grouped data, these are probably one of these five are the ones that you're going to be looking at and using. So there's max, min, count, average, and sum. Max, min, count, average, sum. Okay, that's in no particular order. Okay, you probably will end up using the count more than anything else, or maybe the sum more than everything else, but it really depends on what kind of system you're designing and what kind of data you're actually storing, okay? So really, these are very easy to understand. Max is the maximum value in the bucket. Whatever bucket it is that we're looking at, it just finds the maximum value. Because remember, with grouping data, we put data points, so rows of data, into specific pigeonholes. We pigeonhole it. We put it into specific buckets. And based on that bucket, inside of that bucket, we look at what data we have, what rows we have, and then we do a search based on all those rows. We look for whichever one has the maximum value. Okay, and we can specify what value we want to be looking at in case your row of data has multiple sort of data points multiple columns that where we could be inspecting the value of. In any case, you'll see what I'm talking about in just a moment. Same goes for min. It's just obviously the opposite of max. It looks for the minimum value in the bucket. The count is a little bit different because the count looks at the total of all the rows in the bucket. It doesn't necessarily look at an individual value. It looks at the overall count. So how many rows, how many data points are there in a particular bucket? Okay, that's sort of a good thing to understand the difference between count and everything else. Count looks at sort of the overall picture, the overall number of rows in a bucket, whereas the min, max, average, and sum, you can actually look at the individual columns of the rows that are inside of a bucket, okay? So obviously then the average is just the average value across all the rows in the bucket. And the sum is, the sum or the addition of all the values in the bucket. So the keyword here is that max, min, average, and sum all refer to values. See, sum, value, average, value, min, value, max, value. Count does not make reference to a value, it makes reference to the rows inside of the bucket. Again, this will become clear when we look at the examples. So, let's talk about when we use these aggregate functions. Aggregate functions typically can only be used when you have your aggregated data, or rather when you have aggregated your data. That's a tough word to say, apparently. It doesn't make sense to perform an aggregate function on data that hasn't been aggregated. You typically, like I said, only use these functions when they're combined with a group by command. That's not to say that you cannot use them without a group by command. I don't want you to get that impression. But typically speaking, 80 to 90% of the time, you're going to be using aggregate functions as they are combined with a group by command. So, for example, if you were to perform a sum on transactions without grouping, here's what you'd get. So if I did a select star, comma, sum of the amount, again, sum refers to a value. This is the value that we're performing our function on. We do sum amount from transactions. Here's what we get, okay? You see that we haven't done anything we haven't selected or put in any sort of command with respect to group by, okay? So there's no group by command here, but you see it only returns one row. Okay, so you see that it's trying to group it together all on its own because these typically are used in a group by statement, a group by command. All right, so there you go. So now you see it returns this data, and this data doesn't really make sense, right? Even if I've said select star, so it's showing you every single row, every single column. So obviously these columns make no sense. I mean, this is the summation of all of the amounts inside of all the different transactions, of which I think there's 9 transactions. So this is the sum of all 9 transactions. But obviously this data says transaction ID 1. So I mean, again, this is just picking the first data point inside of this quote-unquote bucket, because there's only going to be one bucket here because we haven't done any grouping. So it just picks the first data point inside of the bucket, and the first data point for the date, and the first data point for the amount, and the first data point for the transaction type. But this is a summation of all the data points together. So, I mean, again, this doesn't make any sense. I could have gotten away with, I probably should not have put select star because that's a bit misleading. Let's pretend that I just done select sum from transactions, okay? And then we can disregard all 4 of these columns and only look at the sum of the amount. But even then, when we look at the sum of the amount, which is $2,500 some odd dollars and some odd cents, this result doesn't make too much sense since the data is not grouped by transaction type. So this is the sum of all the transactions and all the transaction types. So I mean, this data isn't necessarily useful to us because, like I said, it's a representation of both credits and debits together, and it doesn't represent anything really meaningful. So that's why, typically speaking, this example just sort of illustrates that it's helpful to group the data together whenever we are using aggregate functions like sum or like max, min, amount, etc., etc. Or not amount, sorry, average. Okay, so let's look at some more examples. These are examples that we're going to be looking at in correspondence with, in tandem with the group by statement. Okay, so we will select, instead of saying select star, because saying select star when you group data doesn't really obviously tends to lead to strange results. So instead, it's typically helpful to combine. When you're selecting, you select the column that you're grouping by. Okay, that's always a good thing to do. So if you group by this type of column, then you should be selecting that column. So if you group by transaction type, you select transaction type. If you're grouping by transaction ID, you should select transaction ID. If you're grouping by amount, you should select amount. Okay, you get the idea. So we're grouping by transaction type, we select transaction type, and we look at the max amount. Again, max, min, and average, as well as sum, all deal with the values individually. So that's why we have the value that we've stated in here, which in this case is the amount. So we are looking at the maximum amount from transactions where we are grouping by transaction type. So we group by transaction type first. Always, you have to remember that we have to figure out our buckets first before we execute the amount. I'm saying this, the actual SQL command, the RDBMS, the Relational Database Management System, which in this case is MySQL, MySQL will do all this for you. Okay, you're just telling it what you want. It's going to figure out how to do it. But I'm just saying, for you in your own mind, if you were to pretend that you were the RDBMS, if you were to pretend that you were MySQL, whenever you see a statement like this, you first picture yourself grouping the transactions, or you group the data into the buckets first. So we group the data into the buckets, which means we get 2 different buckets, which means we have, I don't know, I think there was 3 credits transactions and there were 6 debit transactions, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. So we'd have 3 transactions in here into transaction type C, and we'd have 6 transactions in the transaction type of D. And then from those 3 transactions and from those 6 transactions, we want to know what the maximum amount is. So if you look, I think the 3 transactions that were in the type of credit were, I don't know, one was like $100, one was $250, and the third was $1,858.81. So obviously, if you look at that, the maximum of those 3 is going to be $1,858. So that's the one that it shows. And the same goes for the debit transactions. There was, I think, debit transactions ranging from somewhere around $1 to obviously $188. So the maximum there is $188, and that's the one that we see here. Okay, same thing goes for the min. Same rules apply. We group the data first into 3 and 6, depending on what transaction types there are. Again, in our example, there's 3 credits and 6 debits. And we look at the minimum amount for each of those buckets. So in the credit bucket, the minimum one was $100. Okay, minimum was $100, max was $1,800. And for the debits, the minimum was $1.81, and the maximum was $188. Sound good? Sound easy? Sound reasonable? Hopefully it does. All right, same thing. Let's look at the average now. So what does the average do? Well, the average is going to do this behind the scenes. It's going to take all 3 of the transactions inside of the credit transaction type that we have in our database table. It's going to add them up and then divide them by however many there were. So it's going to add up all 3 of our transactions, which totals whatever that happens to be, and divide it by 3. The resulting transaction, or the resulting amount, is this: $736.46.3 repeat cents. Okay, there you go. That is the average. Same thing for the deposits, or the debits, which is not deposits. That's the opposite of a deposit, is a debit. We do the same thing. We add up all 6 of them, and then we divide by 6 to give us a total of 52 point whatever that is. Okay, so there we go. That's the average command, aggregate function, I should say. So there we go. So those are all similar in how they function. Then there's the count. The count is a little bit different. Like I said, the count doesn't really concern itself with any individual column inside of the data that's grouped. Instead, it looks at the overall rows. So that's why with count, we use count star, because we're just counting all of the rows. We could have put count of amount. At least I think we could have, and it probably would have given us the same results. But just to be explicit with what it is that we're doing, I just put count star, which means count everything, count all the rows. And this is what we get. So this confirms what I've been saying this whole time. I've been assuming that there's 3 credit transactions and 6 debit transactions, and this is exactly what we see. There's 3 credits and 6 debits. So that's what the count does. The count just counts up the individual rows inside of the data that's been grouped, which in this case is 3 and 6. Okay, so there you go. That is how we use aggregate functions. Hopefully this sheds any panic feelings or any intimidation type feelings that you've had about the word aggregate data and the words aggregate functions. Because as you see here, it's really pretty straightforward. As long as you understand how data is grouped and grouped into buckets and all that stuff, then it makes aggregate functions just kind of an extension of that, and fairly simple concept to follow. All right, fantastic. Hope this was very helpful for you, and I guess we can move right on into the next lesson. I can't wait to see you there. Bye for now.